Picture a boy dressed in miniature armor, strutting through the blood-slicked sands of the Colosseum, while crowds roar his name, Little Boots. They call him the darling of the empire, but under the smile lies a crack. That boy grows into something Rome will learn to fear: a god in human skin, a perversion of power, a tyrant who poisons the soul of the empire. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. You know him as Caligula, and he is the Roman Empire's most beautiful nightmare. Picture a little boy dressed like a soldier. His sandals thump through the camp like thunder as grizzled veterans cheer him on. He wears a miniature uniform fitted just for him, complete with tiny boots. Caligula, they call him Little Boots. To the Roman legions, he is the son of a god, the symbol of military glory, the shining child of General Germanicus. But behind the toothy grin and the childlike charm, something is growing, something quiet, something cold. This boy will not become Rome's savior. He will become its nightmare. Caligula was born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 AD. His father Germanicus was Rome's golden general nephew of the Emperor Tiberius, a man of the people and adored by the army. His mother Agrippina the Elder was a granddaughter of the mighty Augustus himself. Gaius was the third of 6 children, and though he began life in privilege, the empire around him was already teetering. The glory of Augustus had given way to suspicion and decay. Rome in its bones was beginning to rot. From an early age, Caligula was soaked in blood. Not just the blood of battles, though he marched with his father on campaigns across Germania, but the blood of betrayal. His father died when Caligula was just 7 years old. Officially, it was illness. Unofficially, everyone knew Tiberius had him poisoned. Germanicus had grown too popular, too beloved, a threat. The same fate would soon claim Caligula's mother and 2 of his brothers. One by one, they disappeared, locked away, starved, murdered. The Senate did nothing. The people mourned, but only quietly. The message was clear: power in Rome was not inherited. It was seized or it was destroyed. At just 12 years old, Caligula was sent to live with his great-uncle Tiberius on the island of Capri. To the world, Capri was paradise, blue waters, marble villas, warm breezes. But to those who lived inside the emperor's compound, it was a prison of flesh. Tiberius had withdrawn from Rome years before becoming a shadow emperor. He ruled through fear, through letters, through deathless. On Capri, he indulged his worst urges with no one to stop him. Here, Caligula learned what it meant to rule. He watched as men were tortured for amusement, thrown off cliffs into the sea for minor offenses. He saw boys and girls used as playthings, bodies offered as gifts, innocents devoured under torchlight. Tiberius was said to keep minnows, children trained to satisfy him in his baths. Caligula did not flinch. He did not cry. He learned. He adapted. He survived. It was said that Caligula was a perfect actor during his years on Capri. He watched silently as the emperor grew more deranged, more paranoid. He smiled when Tiberius smiled, laughed when Tiberius laughed, never showed anger, never showed ambition. No more evil servant of the emperor than Caligula won account notes and no better slave. This was his armor: obedience as camouflage, patience as a weapon. Inside, he was waiting. Behind closed doors, Caligula had a single goal: to outlive the others. His only remaining brother Drusus had been imprisoned and starved to death. His sisters were scattered or under surveillance. He knew the odds, and yet he endured. Perhaps he believed in his own survival. Perhaps he believed he was already more than human. Tiberius, who distrusted everyone, kept Caligula close but did not kill him. Some say he saw himself in the boy. Others claim he wanted an heir who would continue his terror. But there was one man who threatened this fragile arrangement: Tiberius's own grandson Gemellus. As Tiberius aged and weakened, the question of succession loomed like a sword in the dark. Would the old emperor name his blood or his shadow as the next ruler of Rome? The answer came in 37 AD when Tiberius fell ill. Some say Caligula nursed him. Others claim he smothered the emperor with a pillow. Either way, Tiberius died, and Caligula stood over his body as Rome held its breath. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal army, declared Caligula the next princeps. The Senate followed like sheep chasing a wolf in silk. At first, Rome rejoiced. The people flooded the streets, offering sacrifices and prayers. Caligula, handsome and young, was hailed as the savior of the Republic. Statues were erected, coins were struck, prisoners were freed, taxes were relaxed, games were held. The city pulsed with a kind of mad hope. They had no idea what they had unleashed. What they didn't know was that this was not a man molded by virtue or philosophy. This was a man forged in cruelty, sharpened by silence, and soaked in the blood of his own family. Caligula didn't just learn power, he learned its most depraved shapes. He had watched an empire rule by fear. Now it was his turn. From the moment he took the throne, Caligula understood one thing. He was not just an emperor. He was the son of Germanicus, the blood of Augustus, the rightful god of Rome. He had waited long enough, and soon the entire world would kneel not to a man but to a monster. When Caligula stepped into power, Rome exhaled. After years under the cold, paranoid gaze of Tiberius, the people welcomed the young emperor like sunlight after a plague. His coronation was greeted with cheers, sacrifices, and week-long festivals. Temples overflowed with incense. The Senate bowed without resistance. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty he had quietly secured, stood watch like hounds before a god. Caligula had won without war, inherited an empire without lifting a sword. But Rome, in its hunger for hope, had misunderstood what it had crowned. At first, Caligula played the part of the Golden Prince beautifully. He restored exiles to their homes, halted treason trials, and paid off debts left by Tiberius. Gladiatorial games returned in full glory. Bread and wine were given freely. Taxes were eased. He paid tribute to his late mother and brothers, their names once erased, now etched into stone and memory. Rome mistook these gestures for mercy, but they were masks. Caligula wasn't healing Rome. He was dressing it for a feast. Then came the illness. Barely 7 months into his reign, Caligula collapsed. Fever burned through him like fire in dry timber. Some sources say it was epilepsy. Others claim poison. A few speak of demonic possession. What is certain is that for weeks he hovered between life and death. Rome prayed. Offerings were made. Sacred texts were read aloud in the Forum. And when he finally rose from his bed, the people wept with joy. But something in him had changed. The smiling boy emperor was gone. What emerged was something colder, stranger, more hollow. His stare lingered too long. His silences stretched into menace. He began to speak of visions, of gods, of stars whispering in the dark. Some nights he would wander the palace in silence, eyes wide, muttering to himself. His appetite for pleasure exploded wine-sex blood. His appetite for control deepened further. The first sign came quietly. Caligula summoned Gemellus Tiberius' grandson and his former rival for the throne. He handed the young man a goblet of wine. When Gemellus hesitated out of fear of poison, Caligula smiled. Days later, Gemellus was dead, accused of plotting against the emperor. No trial, no appeal. Just gone. Then came Macro, the Praetorian commander, who had helped Caligula seize power. Once a kingmaker, Macro had grown too proud, too visible. Caligula stripped him of his titles, forced him to commit suicide. His wife followed soon after. Rome learned quickly loyalty bought nothing. Gratitude had no place in the empire of a god. From there, the purges began. Senators who had once toasted his name were arrested in the night. Some for old grudges. Some for glancing the wrong way. Others, it seemed, for no reason at all. Their bodies vanished into the Tiber. The Senate stood mute. They bowed deeper. They wrote poems praising his wisdom and divinity. But Caligula saw through them. He told them so. "I can do anything to anyone," he said once, "and all you can do is watch." He began dressing like a god, not in metaphor, but in reality. One day Jupiter, the next Apollo, then Venus, goddess of love, complete with veil and silk. He walked barefoot through the temples and demanded priests rename him in their prayers. Statues of the gods were decapitated, their heads replaced with his. He ordered a colossal statue of himself, built atop the Capitoline Hill, its finger pointed at the heavens. Each night torches illuminated his likeness as if the stars themselves answered to him. In his court, Caligula's madness infected everything. Visitors from distant provinces were forced to bow as if before divinity. Diplomats who hesitated were mocked or beaten. One Jewish delegation refused to worship his image. He threatened to turn their temple in Jerusalem into a shrine to himself. Only his sudden distraction spared them. He began to whisper of immortality not in metaphor but in flesh. He spoke of cutting open his own veins to see what divine blood looked like. He told the Senate that his words were law, not because he was emperor, but because he was eternal. The laws of man no longer applied. And if that was true, then so was the unthinkable. He began to play with death like a child with toys. At dinner parties, he would laugh with senators, then point to one and say, "I could have you killed right now." If they laughed, he was pleased. If they paled, he was more pleased. If they wept, he might let them live. For a while. He sat in judgment over trials, but turned them into theater. One day, when a man was sentenced to be beaten to death with rods, Caligula interrupted not out of mercy but boredom. "Kill him with lead," he said, "so I can watch his skull break." When another man was scheduled for execution and begged for life, Caligula told the guard, "Very well, let him live." Then moments later shouted, "Strike the neck," and laughed as blood sprayed across his sandals. The more he leaned into divinity, the more grotesque his actions became. He walked across the Palatine Hill on a bridge built just to showcase his godlike presence. He claimed he would ride across the sea. He declared war on the god Neptune and ordered soldiers to stab the waves and collect seashells as trophies. But beneath the divine mask, fear flickered. His paranoia grew daily. He began to spy on everyone's servants' guard's family. He recruited informants. Whispers became death warrants. The palace floors were polished so finely that the footsteps of intruders could be heard in the dead of night. And every night Caligula listened, for betrayal, for prophecy, for echoes of his own doom. What Rome once welcomed as salvation had become an open wound. The people no longer cheered. The Senate no longer praised with sincerity. Fear filled the streets like fog. The boy with the little boots had grown into a god, and gods in Rome demanded sacrifice. There was a time when Rome bled for glory. Under Caesar, it bled to conquer. Under Augustus, it bled to endure. But under Caligula, Rome bled for his pleasure. The streets didn't flow with the lifeblood of empire, they drowned in the screams of its own people. Rome had always been cruel, but Caligula made that cruelty intimate, personal, ritualized. He didn't rule through law, he ruled through fear dressed in silk. And fear, once unleashed, multiplied like a sickness. The first sign that something had fundamentally shattered came in the Forum. Caligula, dressed in full golden armor, appeared before the Senate not to speak of war or policy, but to receive worship. The senators bowed trembling. He sat on a throne built in imitation of Jupiter's. Before him, the most powerful men in the empire prostrated themselves like temple slaves. One senator hesitated to kiss his foot. Caligula kicked him down the stairs. He had declared himself a living god, Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and Rome was expected to respond accordingly. He didn't simply want devotion, he wanted degradation. Statues of Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo were desecrated, their faces replaced with his own. In temples once sacred for centuries, Caligula demanded sacrifices in his name. Virgins were brought before his image. Bulls were slaughtered under his gaze. The lines between priesthood and servitude blurred until all served one altar, his. He ordered a statue of himself built in Jerusalem's great temple where no graven image was allowed. The Jewish people threatened rebellion. The governor, in a rare act of defiance, stalled the order until Caligula's attention drifted. Even so, the message was clear: there were no gods but him and no faiths immune to his blasphemy. The execution list began growing faster than scrolls could hold them. Nobles, senators, generals, wives, children. No crime was too small. One man was killed. For mentioning the word "goat" too close to Caligula, his high forehead, it was whispered, made him sensitive to jokes about horns. Another was executed for having once hosted a banquet where the food outshone the imperial table. A third was murdered for staying silent when Caligula told a joke. But death alone was not enough. It had to be art, theater, a show worthy of a god's attention. Caligula began to stage executions as spectacles. He would fill the amphitheater with prisoners, thieves, debtors, rebels, and unleash wild animals on them. Sometimes he would delay lunch so he could personally watch the butchery before his meal. If the crowd grew bored, he ordered the first few rows dragged into the arena to entertain themselves. Children, old men, noble women, it didn't matter. The people needed to learn that proximity to power meant nothing. In one infamous moment, Caligula canceled a scheduled set of gladiator games, but told the audience they wouldn't leave disappointed. He had the arena filled with criminals and personally oversaw their slow slaughter. When one of them screamed for mercy, Caligula mimicked the plea in a high-pitched voice, and then signaled for his execution. He was laughing as the blood pooled at his feet. He fed fear like fire. Informants thrived under his rule. Neighbors whispered about each other to avoid suspicion. Families turned on themselves. A son might accuse his father of treason to save his own neck. A wife might poison her husband for fear that Caligula would take her next. The emperor had turned Rome into a game of survival, and no one ever really won. Meanwhile, the treasury bled dry. Caligula had inherited a vast fortune from Tiberius, but he spent it like a man convinced of his immortality. He built floating palaces, massive ships outfitted with marble gardens and even temples. One ship carried a full bathhouse. Another was a floating orgy that never touched shore unless the emperor demanded it. His palaces expanded endlessly, filled with fountains of perfume and gold-leafed walls. He commissioned jewels so large they blinded the courtiers who wore them. When the treasury faltered, he began confiscating estates. Rich men were accused of treason executed, and their wealth funneled back into Caligula's pocket. Then came the taxes. Caligula imposed levies on everything: marriage, lawsuits, grain, doors. Even prostitutes were taxed by the number of clients they took, and he kept the records personally. When that still wasn't enough, he auctioned off the lives of gladiators, nobles, even senators. At one feast, he joked that the next man who coughed would be sold into slavery. When a courtier choked on a grape, Caligula clapped his hands and had him dragged off. He loved to watch men squirm. He once invited a wealthy senator to dinner, flattered him, praised him, and walked him through the palace arm in arm. The next day, he accused him of conspiracy and slit his throat at sunrise. That evening, Caligula dined with the man's widow and asked her to pass the salt. The Senate cowed and cornered wrote poems about his divinity. They renamed months after him. They erected statues and temples. But everyone knew the truth: Rome had become a haunted house, and Caligula was its ghost. He didn't rule with laws, he ruled with uncertainty. It wasn't just fear of death, it was fear of what form it would take. A blade in the dark, a public crucifixion, a quiet disappearance, or worse, being summoned to dinner, because under Caligula, even the invitation could kill. Rome's soul had been inverted. The empire was no longer a republic in name or spirit. It was a stage, and Caligula was both god and director. He wrote the parts. He decided the endings. He alone chose who bled and when and how. And as the months crawled by, the people stopped praying for peace. They prayed for survival. But Caligula was just getting started. The gods had told him he was eternal. Now the only thing left was to make Rome believe it too. Even if it meant tearing apart the last shreds of decency, of kinship, of family itself. Even if it meant dragging his sisters into his bed. In Rome, family was sacred. The Domus household was a reflection of the Republic itself, ordered, hierarchical, held together by tradition. Fathers ruled mothers, nurtured, and siblings protected one another beneath the gods' watchful eyes. But in Caligula's world, family wasn't sacred. It was his playground, his theater, his altar. He didn't honor bloodlines, he conquered them. And the empire that once revered the harmony of kinship watched in stunned silence as he turned it into an orgy of power and shame. Caligula had 3 sisters: Agrippina the younger, Julia, Livilla, and Drusilla. All were daughters of Germanicus and Agrippina, the elder royal by birth and beauty, schooled in virtue and intrigue. From childhood they were seen as Rome's noblest women, but in Caligula's eyes they were more than sisters. They were possessions, or worse, extensions of himself. Drusilla was his favorite. She was a few years older, calm, where he was wild, elegant, where he was erratic. While Agrippina and Livilla navigated court politics with caution, Drusilla walked beside her brother in public with an intimacy that unsettled Rome. He took her as his escort to festivals and feasts, allowed her to sit beside him during Senate meetings, and once declared that she is everything to me. The whispers began early that Drusilla was not his sister but his wife in all but name. And then they stopped whispering, because Caligula no longer cared for secrecy. At palace banquets he would seat Drusilla beside him and lean in to kiss her, not on the cheek but on the mouth. His hands lingered on her waist, on her thighs. Guests looked away, their expressions fixed in frozen smiles, praying not to be noticed. When courtiers referred to her as Princess Caligula, corrected them, "Call her what she is, my Venus." He began referring to all three of his sisters as goddesses, commissioning statues in their likeness. Temples were built with inscriptions to divine Drusilla. Coins were minted bearing her image alongside his own. It was a privilege no Roman woman had ever been granted unless she was the wife of an emperor or his lover. Some claim that Caligula forced all three of his sisters to sleep with him, cycling them through his bed as he pleased. Others say they submitted willingly out of fear or confusion, or the bleak knowledge that there was no other choice. What is certain is that no one dared intervene. The Senate, stripped of its dignity, sat idle. The people, battered by taxes and spectacle, stayed quiet. The gods, if they watched, did not speak. In 38 AD, Drusilla fell ill. Fever consumed her, and Caligula remained by her side day and night. Some say he refused to eat. Others claim he slept beside her dying body. When she died, Caligula broke. He screamed, tore at his robes, struck his servants, and disappeared from public life. The city fell into a frightened hush. Then the funerals began. Not a funerals. Days of mourning, each more theatrical than the last. He declared Drusilla a goddess, the first woman in Roman history to be deified. Her temple rivaled that of Vesta. A priesthood was created in her name. Virgins lit incense and chanted her praises while Caligula paced the palace in silence, whispering to her ghost. Some say he held secret rituals calling on her spirit. Others claim he tried to raise her from the dead. When he returned to the public eye, he was not healed. He was transformed. His grief hardened into cruelty. His remaining sisters, once cherished, became rivals. Perhaps they reminded him of what he had lost, or perhaps he simply tired of them. Agrippina and Livilla were accused of plotting against him. No evidence was provided, no trial was held. One morning their names were announced in the Forum Traders. They were dragged from the palace, stripped of their titles, and exiled to tiny, wind-swept islands. Some say they were beaten. Others claim they were raped before being sent away. Caligula made no public comment. He simply replaced their statues with his own. But his obsession with family didn't stop with his sisters. It spread like rot to every branch of his bloodline. He humiliated relatives in public, forced cousins into marriages they didn't want, accused his uncles of incest and treason. If they protested, they disappeared. The imperial bloodline, the sacred Julian line, became a wasteland of suspicion and broken names. In private, his behavior grew more erratic. He invited senators to dinner with their wives and daughters, then forced them to watch as he took them to bed. Sometimes he returned to the table mid-act, commenting on their performance. Other times he paraded the women naked through the palace halls while their families wept. He began selecting brides not based on love or politics, but on whim. He once married a woman at her own wedding feast, dragged her from her groom, and declared her his. She was divorced the next week, replaced by another, then another. In 1 year, Caligula married and discarded 4 women, each chosen for her looks, her rank, or her resemblance to Drusilla. But no woman could replace her. In his dreams, it was always Drusilla. In his temples, her name was always first. In his darkest rituals, it was her image he summoned. His need for control, for possession, for a love no god or man could provide, had twisted into something unspeakable. Rome had watched emperors grieve before. Augustus wept for Marcellus. Tiberius mourned his son Drusus, but grief under Caligula wasn't sorrow, it was power unhinged. It was incest crowned and sanctified. It was the death of family turned into a weapon against the living. By the end of 39 AD, the imperial palace was silent. The laughter that had once echoed through its marble halls was gone. Servants walked in pairs, never speaking above a whisper. Guards trembled at each summons. Caligula's sisters were gone. His wife was dead. His child, some say a product of incest, had vanished. And Caligula, he walked alone through his golden rooms, haunted by his own creation. He had taken Rome's most sacred bond family and desecrated it. He had made it a mirror of his madness. The man who once played the boy in little boots was now the god in bloody robes. And gods, when they are wounded, do not heal. They consume. When night fell on Rome during Caligula's reign, it did not bring peace. It brought whispers. The palace gates opened not for senators or generals, but for actors, dancers, prostitutes, and the condemned. Golden torches lit the imperial halls like stage lights. Curtains were drawn. Instruments began to play. And Rome's most powerful man, its living god, stepped onto a stage of flesh and fire to turn his empire into a blood-drenched brothel. Caligula's debauchery wasn't merely personal, it was political. He didn't indulge in sin for pleasure alone. He used it like a whip, like a blade, like a net to trap the elite in shame. If he couldn't control a man through fear, he'd break him through humiliation. If he couldn't destroy a woman through violence, he'd strip her of dignity and parade her before the court. Power wasn't enough for Caligula. He wanted to possess every body, every secret, every soul. The palace became a labyrinth of rooms devoted to vice. There were chambers for wine chambers, for whipping chambers, where senators' wives were brought by force and left ruined. He built a brothel inside the palace walls, staffed not with common women, but with the daughters and sons of noble families. Some came willingly, hoping to win his favor. Others were compelled. There was no safe choice. Refusal could mean exile. Silence could mean death. He turned the imperial court into an endless feast of depravity. At his banquets, the wine never stopped flowing. Naked dancers writhed between the dishes. Musicians played obscene songs while guests were encouraged or ordered to copulate in the open. Senators, once the stewards of Roman virtue, were stripped of their togas and made to perform like animals. Wives were auctioned off for the night to the highest bidder. Sometimes Caligula bid on them himself, then dragged them into his private rooms and returned only to describe their bodies in detail to the humiliated husbands. He married not out of love or alliance, but lust and violence. He once seized a woman at her own wedding, annulled the marriage by decree, and took her to his bed while her new husband watched. Within days he cast her aside, then repeated the cycle with another. His wives were trophies, but also victim symbols of his dominion over Roman society. Caligula was not content to be king or god. He wanted to be priest, actor, beast. He donned costumes and masks, pretending to be Bacchus, the god of wine and frenzy. Sometimes he emerged dressed as Venus, dripping in jewels and perfume, mocking the divine feminine even as he desecrated it. On feast nights, he would descend into the crowd like a gladiator, brandishing a blade, choosing who would serve him with their body or their blood. Sex under Caligula was no longer a private act. It was a tool of control. He raped freely and without consequence. When asked why, he reportedly answered, "Let them hate me so long as they fear me." The fear worked. Women no longer left their homes without veils. Men walked the streets with eyes downcast. Even those closest to the emperor didn't know if they would be summoned for pleasure punishment or both. But it wasn't just Rome's elite who suffered. The common people, those who once worshipped him as a savior, now became his entertainment. He visited prisons and selected men to be executed for his amusement. Sometimes he chose them by lottery. Sometimes he asked for the ugliest man or the oldest or the one with the most children so that the loss would sting deeper. He began to incorporate cruelty into religious rituals. During public festivals, he forced priests to perform obscene acts. Sacrifices were made not just of animals, but allegedly of humans. There were rumors never confirmed, never denied that babies were taken from the arms of prisoners and thrown into furnaces as offerings to his glory. These stories spread in hushed voices, became part of Rome's collective nightmare. Even the gods were not spared. Caligula mocked Jupiter, mocked Mars, mocked the very heavens. In the amphitheater, he staged plays in which he himself played the gods and rewrote the endings. In one performance, he cast himself as Jupiter raping Juno, played by a chained slave. The audience dared not look away. Applause was mandatory. Laughter was enforced by sword. It wasn't theater, it was terror. He used actors and performers as his executioners. Gladiators were trained not only to fight, but to humiliate. They were sent to whip senators during mock duels. Dwarfs were kept as living toys dressed in armor and made to fight animals. Women were forced to reenact myths of rape and murder on stage. The line between fiction and atrocity collapsed, and all of it, every act of horror and indulgence, was framed as art. Caligula saw himself as the director of a divine drama. The empire was his script, its people his cast. But his plays were not meant to entertain. They were meant to dehumanize, to confuse, to numb, to strip Rome of its memory of what dignity once looked like. He wanted to remake the world in his image, and his image was one of absolute domination. Behind the curtain, the palace groaned under the weight of debt. The treasury emptied by his feasts and games had become a black hole. To refill it, Caligula instituted fines for made-up crimes. He auctioned off public offices, demanded tributes from provinces, and ransacked the estates of the dead. He even taxed prostitutes by the number of lovers they serviced, and forced the palace brothel to report profits directly to him. Every night he went to sleep surrounded by guards' candles and silence. And still he dreamt of betrayal, of plots, of knives in the dark. He began to speak in riddles. He wandered the palace halls at night muttering about gods and fate and justice. No one dared to ask what justice meant anymore. Rome, once the light of the known world, was now a stage of screams. Under Caligula, sin became law. Pleasure became punishment, and cruelty became ritual. There were no longer whispers in the palace at night, only prayers that the monster would not choose your name. What do you call a man who believes he cannot die, who thinks his veins run with lightning, and his breath carries the will of heaven? In Rome they called him emperor. But Caligula did not simply rule, he unmade the very idea of rulership. He dragged the imperial crown into a theater of absurdity, where madness wore purple robes and absolute power became a carnival of delusion. He didn't just abuse power, he mocked it, rewrote it, and set it on fire while the empire watched. His madness no longer needed a mask. He ordered his favorite horse Incitatus be made a consul of Rome. Not as a joke, but as a lesson. A stall paved with marble was built for the animal, decorated with ivory troughs and embroidered blankets. Incitatus dined from golden dishes, drank wine from goblets, and wore a collar of gemstones. Courtiers were forced to greet the horse with respect. Some were made to dine alongside him. It was Caligula's way of spitting in the face of the Senate. If a beast could rule, what did that say about the men who bowed before him? In public, he dressed no longer as a Roman, but as the gods themselves. One day he appeared as Mercury, wearing winged sandals and carrying a silver staff. Another, he wore a golden beard as Jupiter. Once he covered himself in women's jewelry and sheer silks to appear as Venus. He spoke of himself not as I, but as we. He stopped acknowledging his humanity altogether. Only Caligula speaks for the gods, he said, because only Caligula is the gods. He demanded divine honors not just in Rome, but across the empire. Statues of him were ordered placed in temples from Gaul to Syria. Governors who hesitated were stripped of office or their lives. Cities that resisted were fined or razed. Those who accepted his image into their shrines were rewarded, but at what cost? Faith bent. Temples crumbled. Rome's sacred order groaned under the weight of his ego. His paranoia deepened. He no longer trusted the walls of his palace. He had tunnels dug beneath it so he could move unseen from chamber to chamber. The marble floors were so highly polished that a whispering footstep could be heard from across the hall. Servants were forbidden to speak unless addressed. Guards were replaced weekly, then daily. Food tasters died mysteriously. He slept with a dagger beneath his pillow and sometimes woke screaming in languages no one understood. He ordered families destroyed for imagined slights. One nobleman was executed because his home had a finer garden than Caligula's villa. A poet was tortured for comparing his voice to a crow. A priest was skinned alive after mispronouncing a hymn. These weren't punishments. They were performances, sacrifices made to feed Caligula's endless hunger for domination. In 40 AD, he left Rome for Gaul, claiming he would conquer Britain. The Senate, terrified of opposing him, funded the campaign. He marched with legions across northern France, established supply lines, built warships. But when they reached the English Channel, Caligula made no move to invade. Instead, he walked along the beach, waved his sword at the ocean, and declared war on Neptune, god of the sea. His soldiers stood in stunned silence. Then he ordered them to collect seashell spoils of war, he called them. Barrels of them were packed and shipped back to Rome, where they were paraded through the streets as trophies. The farce was complete. An entire military campaign reduced to a tantrum at the edge of the world. He rewarded his soldiers with meaningless titles and distributed coins bearing his image, striking Neptune with a trident. Anyone who questioned the campaign's success was executed or disappeared. The absurd had become sacred. Mockery had become law. Back in Rome, the people no longer cheered. Fear held their tongues. The Senate had been hollowed into a puppet theater. Senators bowed, wept, praised the emperor with rehearsed odes, and hoped to survive another day. Those who once plotted now cowered. Those who once led now followed blindly. But fear has limits. Even in Rome, where generations had bowed before emperors and kissed the feet of tyrants, Caligula was something new. He had crossed every line of law of decency of reality itself. There was no policy, only mood, no justice, only appetite. The empire began to fray at the edges. Rebellions brewed in whispers. In the streets, coins bearing his face were defaced in secret. In the provinces, governors delayed his orders, citing weather or translation errors. Even the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal protectors, began to murmur. Behind closed doors, Rome had begun to dream of blood. Not the blood of conquest or justice or sacrifice, but the blood of the god who bled like a man. Caligula, in his golden palace, surrounded by false gods and silken horrors, had no idea. Or maybe he did. Maybe he welcomed it. Maybe somewhere inside the hurricane of madness, the boy in the little boots remembered what it felt like to watch a man die on Capri. Maybe he understood that even gods in Rome are born to be betrayed. But he would not go quietly. In his final months, Caligula doubled down. He ordered more executions. He renamed months after himself. He claimed the moon spoke to him and demanded a statue be erected on its behalf. He began planning to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria, where the people already worshipped pharaohs as living deities. He believed he could rule forever. He was wrong. The trap was already being laid. Daggers were being sharpened. Allies were becoming enemies. The stage he built of madness, blood incest, and mockery was nearly complete. And the final act was coming. Gods don't die, but monsters do. On the morning of January 24th, 41, AD, Caligula rose from his bed with no fear. He had survived plots, poison, and plagues. He had defiled Rome's gods, its laws, its daughters, and still the empire bowed. Why would today be any different? He dressed in a robe of imperial purple, heavy with gold thread. He kissed his reflection in a polished basin and whispered something in Greek. Perhaps a prayer or warning or a joke. Then he left his palace and made his way to the theater on the Palatine Hill. He had no idea he was walking into his own tomb. The plot had been months in the making. It began with whispers among the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, sworn to protect the emperor with their lives. But even they had their limits. They had watched friends disappear. They had watched their commander Cassius Chaerea publicly mocked and humiliated by Caligula, called a woman a coward, a goat. Each insult had been a spark. Now the fire was ready to burn. As Caligula walked through a narrow corridor in the theater complex flanked by a few attendants, Chaerea stepped from the shadows. He called out the emperor's name once, twice. Caligula turned smiling, and then the blade struck. The first wound was to the neck. Caligula reeled. He screamed, but only once. More daggers followed. One pierced his chest, another his belly, then his groin. His guards fled. His attendants froze. The god emperor fell to the marble floor, choking on blood, eyes wide with disbelief. He was stabbed over 30 times. No one knows who delivered the final blow. Outside, chaos ignited. Caligula's German bodyguards began slaughtering conspirators on sight. The Senate locked its doors. Some cried out for a return to the Republic. Others hid, fearing they would be named in the purge to come. But the killing wasn't done. That night, Caligula's wife Caesonia was stabbed to death. Their infant daughter, just a baby, was taken by the heel and dashed against a wall. Rome had tried to erase the monster it had made, but monsters leave shadows. The Senate debated restoring the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard had other plans. They dragged Caligula's uncle Claudius' timid, stammering thought a fool out from behind a curtain. They hailed him emperor on the spot. The machine of empire creaked back into motion, oiling its gears with new blood. In the months that followed, statues of Caligula were torn down, coins melted, edicts revoked. His name was scrubbed from the records. Rome tried to pretend he never existed, but how do you erase a nightmare? The historians who wrote of him, Suetonius Cassius Dio Josephus, could not agree on the details. Was he mad from illness driven by trauma, possessed by arrogance, or born a beast? No one could say. But they all agreed on one thing. For 4 years, Rome was ruled not by a man, but by madness made flesh. Caligula wasn't the first tyrant Rome would suffer. He wasn't the last. But he remains the most haunting. Not because he conquered new lands or waged great wars, but because he turned the heart of the empire inward and devoured it. He took love and made it incest. He took worship and made it slavery. He took law and made it farce. And when the blades came for him, they came not out of courage, but out of necessity. Because even in a world used to blood, even in a city built on violence, there is a limit. And Caligula found it. If you were gripped by this descent into madness, betrayal, and blood, don't let the story end here. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest minds and most twisted legacies. Leave a comment below. What do you think made Caligula the monster he became? Was he born broken, or did Rome shatter him? Thanks for watching, and remember, history doesn't just repeat itself, it haunts.